This is the story that still amazes me every time I hear it. It was something I was very conscious of when I was buying my first home, and even now, very few people know it even exists. This is the story of how a medieval law forced a couple to sell their home. And whilst you're probably assuming this happened centuries ago, maybe the 1600s, perhaps Victorian times, it didn't. It happened in modern Britain. When Gail and Adrian Wallbank inherited Glebe Farm from Gail's father, they never imagined that an old dormant law hiding in plain sight would come back to life when they least expected it. Because lurking in this property's history was an almost forgotten rule dating back to the reign of Henry VIII, a rule that made homeowners financially responsible for repairing part of the local church. And when that church came calling, the Wallbanks had a choice: fight or pay. In 1990, when Gail and her husband Adrian Wallbank inherited the property, they were aware of a clause mentioning church repairs, but like most people, they just thought it was legal noise, the kind of thing that never actually comes up. But just weeks later, a letter arrived. It was a bill from the parochial church council, demanding around £95,000 for repairs to the church's chancel. And that's when their nightmare began. But first, what even is a chancel? Put simply, it's the section around the altar where the clergy and the choir sit. It's often considered the holiest part of a church. And under this ancient law, people who owned certain pieces of land, well, they were responsible for keeping that part of the building in good repair. But to understand how this could even happen, we have to go back almost 500 years to the reign of Henry VIII. During the Reformation, when Henry broke from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England, religion, power and property across Britain were transformed. At that time, some parish churches were run by rectors, priests responsible for repairing the chancel. Over the years, many of those rectories were taken over by monasteries, communities of monks who lived and worked as part of the church. But when Henry dissolved the monasteries, their land, including those rectories, was seized by the crown and then sold or granted to ordinary landowners. Hidden within those transfers was a strange legal inheritance. The new owners stepped into the shoes of the old rectors and inherited their duty to keep the chancel in good repair, a duty that would survive for centuries. That liability never disappeared. It stayed attached to the land itself. Whoever owned it inherited the obligation. Centuries later, Parliament passed the Chancel Repairs Act in 1932, not to create the duty, it already existed, but to modernise how churches could enforce it, replacing church court orders with civil claims. Few used it, and the law soon slipped back into obscurity. So, when the roof of the Aston Cantlow church began to collapse in the 1990s, the church searched through ancient records and they found that Glebe Farm, the Wallbank's land, was built on property once owned by the medieval rector, in law that made them lay rectors, ordinary landlords who, by owning that land, became responsible for keeping the church's chancel in good repair. It sounds absurd. Being forced to pay for repairs to a church because of your land? Surely that's something that needed fighting, and that's exactly what they did. So, initially, the church discovered that repairs would cost around £95,000. When the Wallbanks then refused to pay, the church sued them under the 1932 Act, and this began a fight that would drag on for more than a decade. The Wallbanks represented themselves. They accepted they were technically lay rectors, landowners who were responsible for keeping the church's chancel in good repair, but they argued that enforcing this centuries-old rule breached their human rights, specifically their right to peaceful enjoyment of property under the European Convention of Human Rights. The judge, Ferris J., sympathised, but he ruled against them. This wasn't, he said, a confiscation. It was simply a burden that came with the land. This time, the Wallbanks won. The court held that the PCC was acting as a public authority, and that forcing random homeowners to pay was kinda like imposing a tax, an arbitrary, outdated form of injustice. For a brief moment, it looked like victory. The Wallbanks had beaten the system. After 13 exhausting years, Britain's highest court gave its judgment. The Lords, they reversed the earlier decision, They ruled that the PCC wasn't a public authority at all. It was enforcing a private duty, not acting for the state. And since the Wallbanks had inherited the land knowing about the clause, the law stood against them. It was over. The original repair bill was around £95,000, but by the time the case finally ended in 2003, that figure had grown far beyond the cost of a roof. With years of interest, updated valuations and court expenses, the total claim reached around £230,000. On top of that came roughly £250,000 in legal fees, and another £37,000 to buy themselves out of the liability so that they could one day sell their home. In total, more than £500,000. Their fight for fairness had become a costly mistake, all born from a law written nearly 5 centuries earlier. A small silver lining for the Wallbanks is that they did sell their farm at auction for £850,000, so just enough to pay the church, the legal fees, and to escape with their dignity intact. After the judgment, the Wallbanks described feeling a mix of amazement and relief. They couldn't believe the church had gone that far. Not necessarily unchristian, they said, but certainly unethical and immoral. They had tried to compromise, but the church refused. At one point, they even discovered that the Church of England had asked every diocese to contribute around £10,000 each to fund the case against them. And for the couple, they had to take out a second mortgage. Years of litigation had left them exhausted. It wasn't financial ruin, but it was a devastating and unnecessary loss, all because of a law born from the 1500s. This case made headlines. People suddenly realised this wasn't a relic of the past. It could still strike today. Across England, this forgotten law roared back to life. PCCs were accused of being unchristian and bad neighbours. Some tried to enforce the law and faced immediate backlash. In one village, residents actually threatened to boycott their local church until they withdrew their claims. The church had no choice but to oblige. Other churches, well, they didn't even want to enforce this law at all. They were reluctant, but they were warned they had a legal duty as charity trustees, and they may even lose church funding if they didn't pursue this. The result, and the notoriety, changed property law forever. After the case, conveyancing solicitors began routinely carrying out chancel repair searches during property transactions. Mortgage lenders insisted these checks were completed before approving loans, and a brand new product appeared almost overnight: chancel repair insurance. Eventually, the government did step in, and under the Land Registration Act 2002, churches had until October 2013 to register any existing rights. If they missed that deadline, the liability would vanish once the land changed hands, or was sold, in other words. That solved most of it, but not all. Because if a family still owns the same land, or if a notice was registered before 2013, the duty can still rise from the past, fully enforceable today. So yeah, the loophole, it's narrowed, but it's not watertight. And here you can even see the clause from the house I purchased in 2024. Even today, a church could technically add a notice for a chancel repair liability to my property, even one that's changed hands since 2013. But in practice, it probably wouldn't stand if challenged. However, the fact they still can do that shows just how hard this medieval law is to bury completely. And it just goes to show, a few pieces of English soil still carry a debt from the reign of Henry VIII, a silent promise that the land itself owes a duty to its local church. Thank you so much for watching this video. This channel is just getting started, so a sub and a like would really help, and also let me know if there are any cases or laws you would like me to cover in the future.